Hello, I'm Nafisa, and today I'm presenting economist Paul DeGrawy's paper Design Failures in the Eurozone. Can they be fixed? The paper is an Eurozone crisis, which features his hypothesis that member countries of a monetary union are highly vulnerable to a self-fulfilling mechanism by which the efforts of investors to avoid losses from defaults can end up triggering the very default they fear. While financial crisis represents one of the toughest riddles for economic policymakers, and booms and busts are an unavoidable element of capitalism. Since 2009, when the Greek debt problems came to light, the suddenness and magnitude of changes in Eurozone bond yield spreads have sparked wide debate among economists regarding the likely causes of Eurozone crisis. The debate resurrects conflicting views on debt crisis. The paper represents a number of findings and makes several recommendations. I'll start by looking at the endogenous dynamics of booms and busts, and then I'll move on to the mechanism of economic stabilizers. Finally, I'll outline how to overcome these setbacks. Then I'll wrap up my presentation with a couple of the paper's shortcomings, followed by recommendation. As economist Paul DeGrawy explains how the current financial crisis in the Eurozone developed, distinguishing in turn the three main actors that have played a major role. Firstly, the design failures of the Eurozone find their origin in two factors. The first one arises from the endogenous dynamics of booms and busts. The second one finds its origin in the stabilizers that existed at the national level prior to the start of the union and that were fundamentally transformed when countries joined the monetary union. Now let us expand on these 2 points. Booms and bust dynamics. In the Eurozone, money and monetary policy are fully centralized. However, the rest of the macroeconomic policies, such as government spending, taxation, social policies, wage policies, has remained firmly in the hands of the national governments. While all these differences can lead to idiosyncratic movements that are unconstrained by existence of a common currency. As a result, there is very little in the monetary union that can make the booms and busts coverage at the Eurozone level. In fact, the existence of the monetary union can exacerbate booms and busts at the national level. The reason is that the single interest rate that ECB imposes on all the members' countries is too low for booming countries and too high for the countries in recession. When the Eurozone was started, fundamental stabilizing forces that existed at the national level were taken away. Stabilizers such as lender of last resort function and of the central bank and the automatic budget stabilizers. Suddenly, member countries had to issue debt in a currency they had no control over. Thus, periods of euphoria alternate with periods of depression, amplifying movements in asset prices that are unrelated underlying fundamentals. With no stabilizers, recessions are deeper as fiscal policies are pro-cyclical. Banks holding the bonds are also pushed into insolvency, though the ECB has rescued them. However, the EU sets monetary policy centrally with a single interest rate. All other economic policy resides with the individual governments. For this reason, the booms and bust cycle remains strictly national, not EU-wide. Indeed, having one interest rate for the EU makes the boom bust even worse, as the rate may be too high or too low for many countries. The interest rates were too low in the southern EU countries such as Spain, Italy, Greece, which made their countries boom. This raised inflation and labor costs while sucking in imports from northern EU countries such as Germany. Thus, Germany had a current account surplus because they were exporting greater than imports, which was used to fund the current account deficits of the South. As the paper says, this is like a car salesperson lending a customer money to buy a car. In a monetary union, countries facing external deficits are forced into intense expenditure, reducing policies that inevitably led to rising unemployment. By increasing flexibility through structural reforms, that cost adjustment to asymmetric shocks can be reduced and the Eurozone can become an optimal currency area. This has been a very influential idea and has led Eurozone countries into programs of structural reforms. Countries with external deficits are driven into austerity policies in a monetary union, which eventually led to increased unemployment. What we can see from the graph, which shows how increases in debt ratio has affected the GDP negatively. There is a way to reduce the cost of the adjustment in imbalances in a monetary union if this adjustment can be made to operate symmetrically. Therefore, if the inevitable austerity by the deficit countries can be compensated by a fiscal stimulus in the surplus countries, the negative aggregate demand effects in the former can be compensated by positive demand effects in the latter. As the EU sets monetary policy centrally with a single interest rate, and all other policies reside with the individual governments, such a symmetric adjustment mechanism did not operate in the Eurozone after 2010. When the large external imbalances in the Eurozone were exposed, the deficit countries were forced into austerity, while the surplus countries tried to balance their budgets. The result has been to create a deflationary bias in the Eurozone. Now comes the most interesting part of this paper, which is redesigning the Eurozone. The existence of design failures raises the question of how the governance of the Eurozone can be redesigned so as to avoid future disintegration. This is the question that Paul de Grauwe answers with his ideas to govern the Eurozone sustainably, overcoming design flaws in the euro area to support growth and stability. The author argues full fiscal union is the answer, making the EU a single country like the USA. This is currently impossible, so instead he proposes pulling government debt partially, and then insurance mechanism and banking union. When it comes to pulling government debts, naturally this helps the nations to get out of the crisis situation. However, it also encourages bad debts in financially incompetent countries and raises the interest rates, which they generally benefit when they generally benefit from the low interest rates. So the pulling should only be partial, with countries having some of the responsibility for their own debts. And then comes the insurance mechanism. A country issues bonds tied to its own GDP growth rate and deposited in the CDA agency. The agency then issues its own bonds tied to the EU GDP growth rate. Those countries with the high growth rates will then pay into the CDA. Those with low growth rate will withdraw money from CDA. Together, the CDA breaks even. Then comes the banking union. National banks comes under the care of the ECB and lose their symbiotic relationship with their own government. For example, Nevada, high private debt threatened the banking system and exposed the Nevada government, so the federal bank stepped in. This did not happen for Ireland, and it suffered for the problems of high government debts. Before I finish the presentation, it is important at this point to make two important clarifications on the scope of the analysis, which the paper does not cover, which is, can Eurozone be really fixed? According to Fisher and Hacker, the Eurozone crisis has been economic crisis, and Paul de Grauwe's proposals are too focused on economics dimension. Still, all the major initiatives such as scheme produced by ECB, precedents of the European Council, at least pay lip service to the central value of the political institution. Democracy, legitimacy, and accountability. Efforts of institute fundamental reforms of the Eurozone in response to its crisis have been underway since 2011 and have already led individual institution changes such as the European Banking Union. but member states have failed to achieve consensus over further reaching reforms such that the proposals under discussion encompasses a wide range of different objectives and scales, which implies distrust among the members, stopping the reform from the root to happen. And I believe this is where I finish. Thank you for listening. And after this, I have the reference slide where I reference the other two authors whose opinions I have used to argue the author Paul de Grauwy's paper. Thank you. Have a great day.